So tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Evangeline Sena. Evangeline is portraying Maria Josefa Jaramillo Carson. Dr. Sena spent many years as a teacher and administrator in Denver public schools. After retirement, she became a storyteller so she could return to the school environment and continue to work with children by telling stories to them. Dr. Sena was drawn to Maria's story because of their shared Hispanic heritage. Her ancestors, like Maria's, made the long journey in 1693 from Mexico to what is now New Mexico in the reconquest of New Spain after the Indian revolt of 1680. Maria Josefa was the third wife of Kit Carson, the famous guide, hunter, and military general. Hers is the story of a young Hispanic girl from New Mexico who quickly became a woman and fulfilled her destiny as a loyal and faithful wife and mother. Maria's life in the mid-1800s was typical of the lives of many women of her culture in that time period. These women faithfully kept their families together while their husbands were off at work, many times far from home. At the end of the presentation, you will have an opportunity to ask questions of Maria Josefa in character and of Dr. Sena as the researcher and writer of the story. In character, she can answer questions regarding her life with Kit. Other questions are better answered by Dr. Sena, researcher and scholar. Please join me in welcoming Maria Josefa Jaramillo Carson.
Buenas tardes. Good evening. I am so pleased to have this opportunity to be here to share with you the joys, the hopes, the dreams, as well as the frustrations, the hardships, and disappointments that I experienced as a wife of Kit Carson. My mind is so full of memories, I don't really know where to begin. But I guess I should start at the beginning. My family and my parents and friends called me Chepita, a loving nickname for little Josefa or Josefita. I was born on March 27th of 1828 to a wonderful family, a family whose great-great-grandparents were among the early settlers who first came to this part of the country, to Nuevo Mexico. They came with Don Diego de Vargas in 1693 to reestablish the colonies that had been destroyed during the Pueblo Indian revolt. I remember the stories that my grandmother used to tell that had been told to her by her great-grandmother of that long, hard journey. It was a hard journey. They left Zacatecas, Mexico City. They went to El Paso, where they joined up with the group that actually had fled during the Pueblo revolt. They got all together, and then they headed north in October. A strange time to head north in October. They were on their way to Santa Fe to regain the villages that they had lost. It was a long, hard journey. And they walked alongside their carretas, those wooden carts with the big wooden wheels that moaned and groaned and squealed as they rolled along. Their belongings were piled high on the carretas. And one of the carretas was a very special treasure. It was a statue of Nuestra Señora la Conquistadora. The statue had been rescued from the burning church. They took her to El Paso, restored her, and they were bringing her back to place her in the new church that they would build. Their children ran up and down the caravan, playing with all the other children. When they got tired, they'd come back to their family, perhaps give them a drink of water, a piece of jerky or a little something, and picked up and placed on top of the belongings on the carreta to rest, perhaps to take a nap. It was definitely a long, hard journey. They suffered from lack of food. They didn't have a whole lot of food with them. And it was sometimes cold. They lost some of their party. Some of them died on the way. But they made it. They got to Santa Fe in December. They camped out on the frozen ground. And it took quite a while, several weeks, before they could get into their little village, into the settlement. The Indians had actually made a rock wall around the compound. And they continued to say their prayers to our Nuestra Senora. They had on the trip taken her out every night and placed her where they prayed the rosary to her. And now they had her in a special place too, where every night they would continue to pray the rosary so that they would be able to get into their settlement. With the help of 140 Pecos Pueblo Indians and all the prayers that they'd been saying, finally after several weeks they were able to regain their settlement. When they got in the homes though, they were in terrible shape. They were in need of much repair. And the people were running out of food. They didn't have much of anything to eat. There was plenty of firewood because they could go out and gather it. But it was a hard few months for them. And then in the spring, they survived though. And in the spring, some of the families, about 5 of them, including my ancestors, went farther north to reestablish the village of Santa Cruz de la Cañada. And the family lived there for 5 generations until shortly after I was born, my father moved our family to Taos, where he became a merchant on the Santa Fe Trail. And we became acquainted with all the trappers and traders that traveled up and down that trail. In fact, my sister Ignacia, who was 15 years older than I, actually married one of these gentlemen. His name was Charles Bent. Oh, my parents were not too happy with that union. They had hoped that we would marry descendants of the early colonists, and they at least had hoped for marriages in the church, and that had not happened with Ignacia. Nevertheless, I spent a lot of time at Ignacia's home where I played with her children, and it was there that a certain young man would come visit my brother-in-law Charles. His name was Cristobal Carson. He was a good friend of Charles's, and Charles called him Kit. Kit was so good to us youngsters. He always came with his pockets full of stuff. He'd pull out a spinning top, maybe a packet, envelope with paper dolls. He'd bring ribbons for our hair. He always brought a bag of peppermint candy. You know, that hard candy wrapped in red crinkly paper? When you'd unwrap it and put it to your mouth, it was so refreshing. Oh, I loved with what he would bring. And he would say to me, Chepita, you would love the adventure. Sleeping out under the stars at night, seeing the big herds of buffalo as far as the eye can see, that big Missouri River with boats on it that are so big, they carry hundreds of people and lots of goods on it. I loved his stories and I looked forward to his visits. One day, he actually came to my parents' home. I happened to look out the window and I saw him coming up the trail. I think my heart skipped a beat a little bit. But the minute he came, knocked on the door, and Papa invited him in, he immediately said, I have important business to discuss with you, Don Francisco. Well, Mama and I, upon hearing that, went to the kitchen so that they could talk. When Kit left, I overheard the conversation between my parents. Papa said, Kit wants to marry our Chepita. What? Said Mama. She's but a child. He's much older. Besides, he's not even Catholic. I know, said Papa. But he promised to wait till she turns 15. He'll wait a year. And in the meantime, he'll become Catholic, and they can be married in the church. Mama just shook her head, knowing full well that permission had already been given. It didn't really matter what she thought. But then she thought, well, Chepita talks about him a great deal when he's been visiting over there. I think she likes him. He's not a bad man. You know, I don't even think he drinks. So she thought maybe it wasn't such a bad idea after all. But what did I know of marriage? At 14, I was still playing with dolls with my cousins. The next few months were very busy. Mama and Ignacia took it upon themselves to teach me everything I would need to know. They taught me how to make the calditos, the stews and the soups, the frijoles, the beans, the chile, the red and the green ones. Mama taught me how to make tortillas because Papa said no girl should ever marry without knowing how to make tortillas. She taught me how to make the bizcochitos, those sugar cookies with anise in them, covered with cinnamon sugar on top. She made me clean house to be sure I knew how. She taught me how to sew and many other things that I would need to know. And the time went very quickly. And before we knew it, it was January, and Kit came home to prepare for the big day. As usual, he came bearing gifts. But this time the gifts were different. It was yards of beautiful, silky, smooth white satin, yards of exquisite Spanish lace, and a fine comb for my hair, and fine shoes and stockings. Mama and Ignacia went to work immediately, and I had the most beautiful white wedding gown with a Spanish lace mantilla for a veil. We were married on February the 6th of 1843 at the little church of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Taos. It was a beautiful mass, a beautiful wedding, all any girl could hope for. And after the wedding, after the mass, the musicians played in front, and we accompanied them on a procession to our house, where Mama had left preparations for a meal to be served. She had, before she left, had placed a little table at the entrance called the banquete that had little glasses of wine, little glasses for wine, bottles of wine, and trays of bizcochitos. And on that table, she always would place, on the wedding banquete table, they had two little bowls with water, one with soapy water, one with clear water. People could help themselves to a glass of wine and a couple of bizcochitos while they waited for a place to open up at the table that they could be seated. And when they finished drinking their wine, they would swish it in the soapy water, and then swish it in the clear water and put it on the clean trapo, the clean dish towel, so that there always were clean glasses. It was, the meal was wonderful. And after the meal was finished, they took all the tables out and placed them outside. And they put the chairs all around the big room, the living room. And then the musicians started playing. They played the Marcha de los Novios, that beautiful wedding march that everybody takes part in. And it goes outside even in the yard and then comes back into the house. And inside they form a kind of tunnel with the couples holding hands up above, and people go through under the tunnel. It is just so much fun. And at the end of the dance, they played the entrega, that beautiful ceremony where the bride and groom are delivered to each other, and the bridesmaid and groomsmen are no longer responsible for them. I felt so grown up throughout that whole day. After all, it wasn't uncommon for girls of 15 to be married, and it was only a month before my 15th birthday. Kit was so good to me. He had bought this little house about 2 blocks from my sister's house, not too far from my parents. He treated me like a queen. He was so good to me. But after a couple of weeks, he said, "Mi Chepita, I have to go to work. I can't stay here with you all the time. I need to find a job. I'll try to find something that keeps me in Taos, but I may have to take whatever I can find." He went out. He was offered a job on the Bent St. Vrain wagon train as a hunter. He took it thinking he'd be back in a few months. He wouldn't be gone that long. But the year before we were married, he had been on an expedition with John Fremont. They were trying to map a route to go from Missouri to California over the Rocky Mountains. And this time, while Kit was in Missouri on the trip, Fremont talked him into going on another expedition. He did get word to me that he would be delayed, but he failed to say when I might expect him home. This was a difficult time for me. I spent time at my parents', at my sisters', at relatives. Anybody that needed help, I'd go stay with them. I was lonely. I had a little house to take care of, but no husband to take care of. I had tasted the bliss of married life, and now I felt abandoned. He was gone for a whole year and 3 months. When he came back, he took odd hunting trips around Taos. And so he was home more often. But after a while, one day he came home and he said, Chepita, my friend Dick Owens and I have found some land east of the mountains from Taos at a place called Cimarron. There, we'll clear the land, we'll plant grain, we'll raise animals, we'll build the house for you, and a house for Dick and a house for ourselves. And he was excited about that idea. And they did. They bought the land, they cleared it, they planted grain. And in the meantime, I was gathering seeds and I was beginning to pack my stuff to go. I was really looking forward to living with him somewhere where we'd be together and he wouldn't have to be off looking for work. Like I said, he was very excited about that whole venture. But one day when he came home, things seemed a little different. He finally blurted out, Chepita, vendimos el rancho. Chepita, we sold the farm. We had to sell it in a hurry, so we got what we could for it. John Fremont sent a messenger that he needs us immediately to help him finish the work we started last year, and I must leave tomorrow morning. I looked at him in disbelief. You sold the farm, I said? What were you thinking? I was gathering seeds to plant a garden. I was going to help you with the animals. I've packed half of our things to move. Dios mío. He sold the farm for half of what it was worth. And then he's taking off again with John Fremont. Maldito, said John Fremont. His sudden departure was a big blow to me. The dream had vanished. I had nothing to look forward to. I quickly gathered my belongings and I moved in with my sister Ignacia and her husband Charles to help her with her family. Shortly after Kit left, there was a great deal of unrest in Taos. There was talk that the Americanos were coming with troops and they were going to take over Taos and Santa Fe. And there was fear for our safety, so Ignacia and I were sent to Bent's Fort for our protection. But by the end of summer, the men that were, the whole thing had taken place. Taos and Santa Fe had been taken over by the Americanos with little resistance, and my brother-in-law was appointed governor. So they thought everything was fine, and they sent for us, and we came home. But then there was again more unrest because there was talk that the Mexicans were going to do an uprising and retake their government and overthrow the Americanos. So that was another thing that they were worried about. But by early December, those men were found out and they were arrested, and Governor Bent thought that disaster had been averted. So he came to Taos to spend some time with his family in early January. He had only been home one night when we woke up early in the morning to shouting and yelling in the plaza about a block away. Mátalo, kill him, don't let him get away. The governor quickly jumped out of bed, put his pants on, threw his suspenders over his shoulder. Ignacia, right behind him, went to the door, opened the door, and looked out and saw the mob coming, a whole big mob coming. ¿Qué pasa? He shouted. What's going on out there? What's happening? We're coming to kill you, somebody shouted from the mob. What? Said the governor. Haven't I always been good to you? Haven't I always helped you when you needed help? Yes, but you're an Americano and no Americano will govern us. You must die. At that, they started shooting bullets and arrows at him. The governor fell backwards. Ignacia quickly slammed the door shut and bolted it. And my niece Romalda and the Indian lady Juanita and I had taken the children into the other room. There, I looked around to see how we could escape. There was no door. There was a little window, but it was to the side where the mob was. So I quickly said to Romalda, get the poker from the fireplace. Bring me some knives from the kitchen, Juanita. We must remove this plaster as quickly as we can. So we chipped and chipped at the plaster and removed this big circle of plaster. Then I said, chip in between the adobes, loosen the dirt so we can pull the adobes out. We managed to pull them out, and I said, there, I think the hole's big enough. The governor shouted from the other room. Romalda, put the children through first, and then you and Ignacia go through. In the meantime, Ignacia had brought the governor into the place where the hole was. We had gone through, and the governor looked at the hole and said, I can't fit through there with these arrows through me. Ignacia quickly broke the arrows and helped him climb up through the hole. Just as we got him into the other room with us, they broke the door down and cut a hole in the roof and came charging in. They were going to shoot Ignacia, but the Indian lady Juanita was in front of her and they shot her instead. They hit Ignacia in the back with the butt of the gun and she fell. We had already gotten the governor into the other room with us. Romalda was holding his head up, looking at him saying, no te mueras, mi padre, please don't die. At that moment, the leader of the mob, they had already come into that house through the hole, and they cut a hole in the roof and broke the door down in that part. They came in, and he grabbed him from the suspenders, threw him to the ground, and proceeded to scalp him with the string of his bow as cleanly as if he had done it with a knife. Leave us alone, I shouted. Please don't hurt us. Leave us alone. Ave Maria Purísima, ayúdanos. Holy Mary, Mother of God, help us. At that moment, the townsman ran in and he said, what have you done here? You weren't to kill him. You were only to take him prisoner. Go. Your work here is done. Leave the women and children alone. Just go. They did. They left. But we stood there just shivering from the shock and the fear and the cold. In the meantime, Ignacia came to and came through the hole. When she saw what had happened, she took us to the corner fireplace and built a fire to try to keep us warm. It didn't help much, but I kept thinking of Kit. Where is he? If he had been here, he could have saved us. He had a way with people. He could have talked to him. He could have helped us. I desperately needed Kit to help me, to hold me, to reassure me, to let me know that everything would be all right. The governor was, I didn't know what we would do to survive. The governor was dead. Ignacia was hurt. They'd broken down the doors and tore a hole in the roof. Our house was destroyed. They took everything. They even stripped the governor of his clothing and didn't leave us a blanket to cover him. I desperately wished Kit had been here. But we huddled up close to the fireplace for the rest of the day, and then early the next evening, a kind gentleman came to see what had happened. When he saw what had happened to the governor, he left to arrange for the burial of the governor, and then he returned with warm soup and blankets for us. Early the next morning, a kind lady sent for us and had somebody take us to her home where she provided clean clothes, some warm hot water so we could have baths, and good food. None of us felt like eating. We were so shocked. Again, I kept thinking of Kit. Will they try to kill him when he comes? I desperately needed him to assure me that all would be all right. But it was a whole 3 months before he heard of the rebellion, of the revolt that had happened. When he came, I He repeated over and over what we had been through. I just couldn't seem to tell him enough. He was angry that he hadn't been there to protect us. He was sad about the governor's death, but he was upset because he had to leave again. He was carrying a message from California to Washington, and he needed to get it there as soon as possible. He did spend a day or two with us and left. For the next 2 years, that's what he did. He spent 2 years carrying messages back and forth cross country on horseback. He would stop and spend a day or so with us on his way in both directions. Finally, in the spring of 1849, he came home. And he said, Chapita, this time I have found a ranch south of Taos at a place called Rayado. There's a home already there. You can go with me right away. We will raise cows and horses and mules and sell them to the military. And we did. I went with him to Taos. Sometimes the Indian raids were so bad that he'd have to take me back to Taos. And he took me back to Taos in May of 1850, where I gave birth to our first child. Little Carlos Alfredo was born on May 2nd of 1850. 3 days after the baby was born, Kit had to leave to take a herd of horses and mules to Fort Laramie in Wyoming Territory. It was a bad time for him to have to go. The baby was so tiny and frail, and I was so young. I quickly gathered our things and went to Ignacia's house, where she helped me with little Carlos Alfredo. By the following spring, Kit had talked his nephew and his niece from back east into coming to take care of the ranch at Rayado. And this freed him up so he could take a bunch of empty wagons to Missouri to bring back goods for Lucian Maxwell's trading post. When he came back from that trip, the end of a year after the baby was born, he learned of the death of our little boy. Carlos Alfredo died a month after his first birthday. After that, I spent more time in Rayado. I didn't want to be at the house by after we'd lost the baby. So I spent more time with him there. 2 years later, in October of 1852, I gave birth to our second child, so he took me back to Taos. This time he stayed with me in Taos in the winter because he already had someone taking care of the place at Rayado. So I had help with the little one. But by spring, he and Lucian Maxwell came up with another idea. They each bought large herds of sheep and goats, large hundreds of sheep and goats. And they drove them to California to sell. They left a week apart from each other so that the herds wouldn't get mixed. They left in the spring of 1853, and Kit returned to Santa Fe in December of 1853. When he stopped in Santa Fe, he was all very happy. The sheep and goats had sold for far more than he'd ever expected. It was a very successful trip. And when he stopped in Santa Fe, he was offered the job as Indian agent to be stationed in Taos. So when he came home, he was real excited. His saddlebags were full of money. He had a job now that would keep him in Taos, and he bought me a new sewing machine. He kept that job. He remained in that job as Indian agent from 1854 to 1861, 7 years. Very happy 7 years for us. We'd been together longer than any time before. And of course, more children came. We had 3 more children during that time. And we also had Teresina Bent that was living with us, and 2 older Indian children that Kit had taken in when he was Indian agent. Somehow these 2 were little orphans, and he brought them home. They were older. Oh, I almost forgot. We also had this little baby, this little boy. He was about 2 years old. One day, I was fixing breakfast for the kids in the kitchen at my house there in Taos. And I heard sounds of horses out in front of the house, and I heard men talking. So I peeked through the window to see what was going on. It was a Ute party sitting out there waiting for Kit to come out. Well, Kit wasn't home, so I waited a while to see if they would leave. And when they didn't leave, then I went ahead and stepped outside and said, "Buenas tardes, señores. Can I help you?" "No," said the leader. "We had hoped to talk to Kit. We need to talk to Kit." In the meantime, I noticed they had this little boy, about 2 years old, sitting on the lap of one of the warriors. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, and you could tell he was terrified. So I asked, "Who's the little boy?" They said, "Oh, he's just a little Navajo. We raided their village, and we took him, and we don't know what to do with him. All he does is cry." I knew what they would do with him. So I quickly said, "What would you take for him?" And the leader said, "One of Kit's horses." So I went around the back and to the stable. I got a horse, put a rope halter on him, brought him forward. I handed them the horse. They handed the baby to me. He threw his arms around my neck and his little legs around my waist. I knew at the moment he was mine. I loved our big family. With Teresina Bent and the older children, Indian children we had with us, I had plenty of help to take care of them. It was a wonderful time. We were the longest time we'd been together. I learned to play the guitar, and I learned songs and taught them to the kids. And when Kit would come home, we'd all sing together. It was a great time. But that too did not last. In the fall of 1860, Kit went hunting with some friends in Colorado Territory on the San Juan Mountains. And on that hunting trip, the horse Kit was riding with stumbled and fell over the cliff, taking Kit with him. When they brought Kit home, I didn't think he was going to live. He was so badly banged up. I treated his wounds with all the poultices I knew how to make. And I fed him his calditos that he loved. It took the whole winter, but by spring he was feeling pretty good. He was walking around, but he had internal pains that always bothered him. About the same time that spring, there was word that we were being attacked from the south, and that volunteers were needed. People were encouraged to join the New Mexico Volunteers. So Kit joined to help with the situation during the Civil War. He thought when the Civil War was over with that he could be released and he'd be able to go home again to his family, but that didn't happen. General Carleton knew of his expertise with the Indians as their Indian agent, and he ordered him to bring the Indians under control. During the time of the Civil War, when the troops were busy, the Indians had gotten a little bit brazen and they were raiding all the villages. So it was Kit's job to get them all under control. And then a little bit later in the time too, he was assigned the task of leading all these Indians to reservations. It was a job he hated because he had made good friends during the time he was their agent. Now he was ordered to lead regiments against them. It was a difficult time for him, and he kept asking to be relieved from his duty. But that time I had given birth to our 6th child, Rebecca, and he wanted to be somewhere near that he could help me with the children. He kept asking because his health was getting so bad, and he was in pain, and he didn't like what he was doing. Finally, a couple of years later, in April of 1866, he got the assignment we'd been waiting for. He was ordered to go to Fort Garland in Colorado Territory. And that place had commander's quarters, so the whole family could go. So he came home to Taos, we packed up, and by May 1st, we were at Fort Garland in the commander's quarters. It was a wonderful time. The children loved having their father around. He would fill his pockets with candy, and they would wrestle him to the ground out in the parade ground to get the candy. He let them keep him company in his office, and he loved that. It was a great time. In fact, my sister Ignacia and her daughter Teresina were able to come and help me with my ever-growing family. By then, I had given birth to our 7th child. Estefanita. And this was becoming a little brood. So Kit was happy to be there so that he could help me. And Ignacia, my sister, and her daughter were able to come and help too. But that didn't last either. By the fall of 1867 it was, he was ordered to release the troops and close down the fort. So he did that, and then he went on to Santa Fe to get released himself from duty. And then as soon as he got home back to Taos, we packed our belongings as fast as we could, and we headed east of the mountains to past Cimarron, past Trinidad Way, to a place in Colorado Territory called Boggsville. My niece Romalda was married to Thomas Boggs, and Thomas had built this little village there. Romalda and I had both inherited land from our uncle Cornelio Vejil's land grant there near La Junta, and that's where Boggsville was. We were going to take our children and raise them there on a little farm. We figured we could get our land, build a house, and be comfortable there. So we went. When we got to Boggsville, our nephew Tom was so good to us all the time. He let us have 3 rooms by this little store. So we moved into those 3 rooms. And by then, I didn't see how Kit would ever get our house built. He was very sick. He could barely get around, and he couldn't ride his horse anymore. He had to be taken to see the doctor in a carriage. I tried real hard to keep the family spirits up, but I wasn't doing much better either. By then, I was pregnant with our 8th child. This pregnancy was very difficult. With Kit's illness, the worries of Kit being ill, and I just felt, I didn't feel right. I was weak, I was tired. And my sister, my niece Romalda, and the ladies in the village really helped me a lot, and I appreciated their help. But my faith was ebbing along with my strength. Finally, in January of 1868, the government again imposed on Kit Carson. They wanted Kit to take a group of Ute chiefs to Washington, D.C. to negotiate a treaty. There was no one better equipped to do that than Kit. He had worked with the Utes when he was at the fort. He'd made great friends with them at the time. They trusted him, and he knew he could help them get a good treaty. So he said, Chapita, I must go. The Utes trust me, and I can help them get a decent treaty. But mi amor, I said, look at you. You can barely get around. You'll never make it back. He looked at me imploringly and said, but perhaps I can see a doctor while I'm there and find out what is wrong, and maybe we'd all be better off. In the end, he again listened to his need for serving his country and his duty, and he left. When they finished with all the goings on in Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C., an Indian agent accompanied him to Cheyenne, Wyoming by train. In Cheyenne, they took a carriage from Cheyenne to Denver. Denver, they bought a wagon with a mattress in it so Kit could lie down and rest. Kit did send word, he sent a messenger ahead that he was on his way. I was so anxious to see him that I talked my nephew, Tom Boggs, into taking me in the carriage to meet them, because it had taken longer than I thought it should have taken. I thought Kit should have been home by that time. But I guess they had stopped on the way several places to give him time to rest. We met the wagon about 20 miles out of Boggsville near La Junta. Kit looked terrible. I didn't think he'd even make it home. But we got him out of the wagon, put him in the carriage with me, and we drove together. Tom took us in the carriage home. When he got home, the sight of his family, he was so happy to see his children. And then the food, I was feeding him his calditos that he loved, his little stews and soups. And he began to feel better. So he began to talk of building our home again. but I had not fared as well. 2 days after we got back from that carriage ride, I gave birth to a tiny baby daughter. She was very small. Kit held her in his hands and he said, "Ay, que linda. I will name you Josefita like your mother." And he did, but I was not able to get out of bed after that baby was born. Kit was feeling better, but I just I got weaker and weaker. Finally, I thought to myself, what will happen to these children if I don't get better? I willed myself to sit up and to comb my daughter Teresina's hair. The moment I sat up, I knew I was in trouble. "Kit," I said, "come quickly, I need you." He did, he came and he picked my head up. He looked at me, I looked at him in his eyes and I said, "I am really sick. I think I'm dying. I think this is the end." I looked up into his eyes, I gasped my last breath, and closed my eyes forever. This time, I had left him, but within a month he joined me, and we had indeed left our children orphans for destiny to raise. Thank you. These events happened over 150 years ago, and I remembered them as if they were yesterday. Perhaps you have questions you might want to ask me about my life with Kit Carson.
Question?
I was just wondering whether any of your great-grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren live in New Mexico today.
I died, I wouldn't know.
Did you live in the house that is now the museum of Kit Carson?
Yes, yes, that was the Kit Carson home. Yes. Yes.
How old were you both at the time of your deaths?
It was actually a month after my 40th birthday. Kit was 19 years older than me when we got married. So he was 59, I believe, when he died. Yes.
Did you talk about his other marriages?
He didn't. He didn't tell me about his other marriages.
Did he have children from the other marriages that you had to raise?
No. Like I say, he didn't ever. I didn't know anything about his other. I knew he'd been married before, but he never talked about him.
What animals were used to pull the carretas? Oxen, mules, horses, when you were
Oxen.
traveling?
How many languages did Kit speak?
Kit he could speak, well, he spoke English. He could speak Spanish fluently. That's how I spoke with him, because my English was not so good, but my Spanish, and he spoke several of the Indian dialects.
What did your parents think of him going soon after you were married?
I don't think they liked it, but just like in my case, it was something in that day and age. Not much was said. They supported our marriage, and they tried to help me when he was gone.
What was the question?
I was asking what the parents thought of Kit Carson taking off soon after their wedding.
Yeah. I think it was kind of, like I say, they not much.
Your mother was probably saying, "I told
Wasn't the kid unable to write or read?
Yes.
Did you help him there?
No, because I couldn't write or read much either. But
Could Kit read or write?
No. When he was gone, that I got messages or I got letters, somebody else had written them. And then I'd have to get somebody to read them to me. Mm.
Where are you buried?
Did Kit share stories about taking the Navajos to Fort Sumner and how he felt about that?
Yes, he didn't like what he was doing. He didn't, and I didn't get to see him real often during that time because he was busy and he wasn't allowed to come home. So I didn't really get to talk to him much about that. But I know he hated what he was doing because those Indians had become his friends when he was their agent. If there aren't any other questions, I'll flip around. And many of the questions are better answered by me as a researcher. And at this point, I'm not sure how many I can answer either, but I have my resource here, my husband, who's a historian. I wrote this story about I would say about over 10 years ago. I was doing the research about 10 years ago for it. So much of it the research has kind of gotten away from me, but I try to keep track of it. But anyway, I can answer as far as the children, or what was it you were asking?
I asked where you were buried.
Where we were buried. They were buried in Boggsville first, and then they were taken from Boggsville, and they're buried here in Taos.
Oh, and cemetery behind, pretty much near where the house is.
It's somewhere there. Yeah,
That's right.
yeah. It's. I'm trying to remember because it's been a while since we've been there. Mm-hmm. Do you remember, Val, exactly where it was? Where they were buried in Taos?
Oh, they're buried in the cemetery north of Taos.
The cemetery north of
It's
town.
called the Kit Carson Cemetery. I
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I thought they were closer to the museum or somewhere, but I don't know.
No, they were buried, they're still there. They didn't move.
Okay.
North of Taos, Kit Carson Cemetery. And for those of you who've been at Taos, there is a Bent Street, just a block from that main intersection. The main intersection that you go to Taos and you go inside, go to the plaza. A block from there is Bent Street, and you can actually see the house and see the home that the ladies made. Now, Kit Carson's home was from that intersection. You just go about a block or 2 blocks further east, and there's Kit Carson's home. So now the question, and she can answer this better than I can, what about Kit's previous wives?
Yes, that's a good. He was married twice. His first wife was Wanibi, an Arapaho maiden, and that was a love marriage. But she didn't mind him being gone. She knew that was what he did. But when he came home, she always heated water, washed his feet. So she was very loyal to him. She had 2 children. The first one, her name was Adeline. The second one, I was never able to find her name. She died tragically. Somebody that was taking care of her, she fell into the kettle of hot grease. So that was tragic. But Adeline grew up. He finally, before he married Maria Josefa, he took Adeline back east to one of his aunts, and they raised her. Any other questions?
Next wife.
Oh, the next wife, yes. You can tell I'm tired. The next wife was Making Out Road. She was a Cheyenne maiden, but she didn't put up with his shenanigans. She didn't like the idea that he had a little girl and she was to take care of her when he was gone. And so one day when he came home, he found his belongings and stuff outside of the teepee. But by then he wasn't too concerned because by then he already had his eye on Maria Josefa in town. Yeah. Yes.
Didn't Kit Carson have a back? Kit Carson was little, he was only about 5'5" or 5'6", I know that. And I have been to the museum before and also the government bent house at the college. Did he have a battle with a giant Frenchman?
Yes.
And
No,
I guess
that was Albert Pfeiffer.
No, but Kit did too.
Did too?
Kit had a battle at one of the rendezvous
Right.
when about the time that he ended
I
up
think
with.
there was over the Arapaho woman too. He may have been.
I don't know. I'm not sure about that one, but I know I read about one at one of the rendezvous when he was about the time that he got involved with Wanibi. I don't know if it was a Frenchman or what it was, but it was somebody he got into big. Yeah. Yes.
How did the children fare after both their parents died?
William was sent back east to go. Excuse me. Let me get a drink of water. And let me also get my cheat notes. William was sent to go with General Sherman. General Sherman, was it? That for him to educate him. Well, the kids had never gone to school. You know, at that point there weren't schools readily available, and it wasn't the law that they had to go to school, so they had not gone to school. So when he sent William back east, the poor kid wasn't in any place where he could learn what he needed to learn to become an army person. So he came back home, and he was in Fort Garland. He was a mailman at a time.
And if you check the 1880 census from the Costilla County area, William Bent is the
William
taker of the census.
Carson.
Carson.
William Carson was the taker. Yeah. There was a problem there too. He was married to Tom Tobin's daughter, Pascualita. And one night, evidently, he got drunk or something, and he beat Pascualita up. And so Tom Tobin went after him. And I know he injured Tom Tobin. He shot Tom Tobin.
That was William.
Yeah, that was William, yeah, that did that. And so the kids didn't live to a ripe old age. Let me just say that much. Carlos Alfredo had died when he was little. William. Teresina was 13 when her mother died, and she lived to 61. Cristobal Carson, the other Kit Carson, and I think one of these Carsons either had a grandson or somebody that owned a furniture store in Alamosa, Kit Carson Trading Post. But Cristobal was 10 when they died. He lived to 70. He had a Charles, too, that lived to 76. Rebecca only lived to 20. Estefanita lived to 32. And Josefita only lived to 24. So they were raised. He sent for Ignacia. He called her La Vieja, his sister-in-law. And he sent for her to come when Maria Josefa died. So Ignacia was Rumalda's mother. So Ignacia and Rumalda, I think, were really kind of the ones that helped raise the kids after they died. But you know, when you stop and think of the trauma that they went through and all the stuff that, it's a wonder they even lasted. It was a rough life. It's a beautiful story in a way because of the culture that's brought through it, but it's a very sad story. But that's the life they lived, and that's how they died. When I was doing the story with the Colorado Humanities, they didn't want me to do the scene at the end where she dies, because that's just not the way you should do it. But my feeling is that that's how they lived, that's how they died, and I think it's important that otherwise you're left hanging without that end. So I chose to keep it.
Vangie.
Okay. Yes.
What did each of them die of?
Both of the and his wife, Maria Josefa, died of, I can never pronounce, purple something fever. You know what it is. It's the fever that women would often get after childbirth. And it's the same thing that killed his Wanibi, too. Both of them died from that. And Kit, when he fell over the cliff, he developed an aneurysm. And that aneurysm is what killed him. Yeah. I think it was in his main artery or something. Yeah, so yeah. Yes.
Have you been able to trace other descendants?
My husband taught some of them in San Luis when he was teaching in San Luis. Some of them went by the name of Martinez, but they were Carson great-grandchildren or grandchildren. William not only had Pascualita, he also had another lady, Martinez, and he had children by her. And those children were in San Luis, so Val taught them. I did get the opportunity once in Denver to do the presentation and have some of those grandchildren were there. It was kind of neat because they came up afterwards and hugged me as if though I were their grandma. Yeah.
Was the family related to the Jaramillos and Chinano?
Probably, you know.
Because there was Santa Cruz and then
Yeah.
moved up.
Santa Chimayo and what is it? The little village that they established are right close together. So they probably.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. If you have more questions, you're welcome to come up and chat with
Yeah. Thank you all. You were a wonderful audience. It was. It was easy to keep my train of thought and keep it flowing because you were with me.
It's a nice venue, too.